I'm extremely happy to welcome the esteemed elder of hacking culture, Richard Stallman. Now, Richard Stallman founded the Free Software Foundation as part of his pioneering campaign against proprietary software. He's been hailed as changing the way the world looks at technology, an eccentric genius, a high-tech Robin Hood who took on the might of Microsoft. In 1984, Stallman launched the GNU project to produce a free replacement for the Unix operating system, which in 1992 became GNU Linux, the first available free operating system that could run on a PC. Richard Stallman is in New Zealand at the moment, and he joins me now. Good morning.
Hi.
I'm so sorry to keep you waiting. It's been an exciting morning so far.
Well, at least I was able to wait indoors.
Yeah, well, that's right. You're lucky because you are in our Auckland studio. Now, your campaign for free software began, just put it in context for me, Richard, 20 years ago or more.
25.
With a jammed printer, the story goes, when you were at MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab. Tell me that story.
Well, that's actually just part of what taught me to appreciate the difference between freedom-respecting software and proprietary software. But we had a printer called the Zero Graphic Printer, and I added various convenient features, such as when it finished a print job, the system would display a message on your screen saying that your print job was done. And when the printer got jammed, it displayed a message on the screen of everyone waiting for a printout saying, the printer's in trouble, go fix it. Well, of course, those people would want it to be fixed, so somebody would fix it. Well, when we got another much faster, improved printer called the Dover, it also frequently got paper jams. I wanted to add that feature, and I couldn't do it because the Dover was controlled by a proprietary program, and we did not have the source code for it. And I never even thought of trying to ask Xerox for the source code. But eventually I heard that somebody at Carnegie Mellon University had a copy of it. Eventually I was there, so I went to his office and said, "Hi, I'm from MIT. Could I have a copy of the printer software source code?" And he said, "No, I promised not to give you a copy." And I was stunned by this, so stunned that I went away thinking about it. I realized that when he signed a non-disclosure agreement, he had betrayed us at MIT, his colleagues. But he had done much more than that. He hadn't just betrayed us. He had betrayed you as well. And in fact, he had betrayed the whole world. And this made me think of the evil emperor in a famous Chinese novel called Cao Cao, who was reported to have said, "I'd rather betray the whole world than have the whole world betray me." And he is considered basically almost like their equivalent of the devil in some ways.
The culture you'd come from at MIT was a hacker culture, right? And you might need to define the word hacker for me because it's not as we most understand it.
Absolutely. What we mean and meant by hacker is enjoying playful cleverness. And this doesn't just mean with computers. If you like playful cleverness, you'll find ways to be playfully clever in whatever medium happens to come to hand.
But in your medium, it was about circumventing obstacles to the extent that you would break into rooms to use terminals, right?
That's a bit different. That was actually sort of the informal policy of the lab, that people were not allowed to lock up the scarce terminals that there were.
But that's part of your philosophy, isn't it?
Right. But the point is that it wasn't so much that I would open these doors so that I could use the terminal, but rather they were supposed to be open. And professors who got above themselves and thought that they were entitled to lock up the scarce terminals when they weren't even there so that nobody could get his work done. That was not allowed, so to speak. And I was enforcing this policy informally.
Just the basic question that people always ask of you, no doubt to your constant irritation, is, looking at Xerox and the printer example, why would Xerox give away a vital part of its commercial product?
Well, it's not a matter of why would they. It's their moral obligation. And I really don't
All right,
sympathize.
why should they?
It's because users deserve freedom. And there are 4 essential freedoms that a user deserves. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. And there are proprietary programs that restrict you even in that. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it to make the program do what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor, which is the freedom to make and distribute exact copies of the program when you wish. And Freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, which is the freedom to make and distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. With these 4 freedoms, then users both individually and collectively have control of their computing and are free also to help each other. So these freedoms are socially essential, and no one ethically has the right to deny them to anybody. So I don't really care whether Xerox wants to respect these freedoms. What I say is if they don't, they should not be doing this at all.
So what do you say, and what did you say to Bill Gates when, in his open letter to hobbyists back in 1976, he said, "Who can afford to do professional work for nothing?"
Well, I never saw that letter. I wasn't using microcomputers. In fact, I never did. And I wasn't even aware of his existence at the time. You'll note that GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix.
That's right.
This isn't a
What
campaign.
do you call that? It's a recursive acronym,
right.
Yeah?
But it's not GNU's not MS-DOS. I wasn't even thinking about MS-DOS, which I considered a toy. And the free software movement isn't aimed at Microsoft. It's only later that Microsoft developed almost a monopoly and people started thinking of that as the thing that you might replace.
However, Bill Gates' question remains valid.
Yes.
What hobbyist can put 3 man-years into programming, finding all bugs, documenting his product, and distributing it for free?
Well, actually, thousands of us do, because his argument is that free software couldn't exist, and the fact is it does. He's like somebody arguing that planes couldn't possibly fly, while you can go to the airport and see them taking off. There are tens of thousands of useful free programs, some big, some small, but that were worth packaging for users to conveniently install in free versions of GNU plus Linux operating systems. So a better question would be, why do people do this? But the fact is we do, and I've seen many reasons for it. One is political idealism like mine, but most people and most of the developers actually don't share that. Another motive is fun, because hacking doesn't just mean circumventing, it means playful cleverness, and solving problems, making a program work can be fun. It's one example of hacking, which many of us enjoy.
Now, you came up with a general public license, a GPL, to counteract software secrecy. How does that work?
Well, first of all, I should explain that the way you make a program free software is by releasing it with a suitable license that gives users the 4 essential freedoms. And we call that license, that statement by the copyright holder, a free software license. Well, there are many ways to do that. There are at least dozens of free software licenses. The one that's used most often is the GNU General Public License, which I wrote. And what's special about it is a condition that we call copyleft. And this condition says, whenever you distribute a copy, whether it's an exact copy or a copy of your modified or extended version, that you must do so in the same way. You must release it under the same license, you must provide the source code, and in general, you must respect the freedom of those who get copies from you, just as we respected your freedom, which you then took advantage of to distribute these copies.
And the underlying philosophy of this is that it's a win-win situation, because by enabling everybody to have access to all the software gets improved for the manufacturer.
Well, actually, no. There are other people who make that argument, and those are the people who promote, quote, open source, unquote.
Which you're very keen to distinguish from your own movement.
Absolutely. Although they're talking about almost the same body of software, with occasional exceptions, the reasons they give are based on different values. They make the argument that this will improve the software for the original developer because they're unwilling to say that that developer is morally obligated to respect the freedom of the users. They base it on practical values only, and they take for granted that proprietary user subjugating software is legitimate. Whereas I say, and we in the free software movement say, that users are entitled to freedom and that proprietary software is a social problem, and we're aiming to correct that problem, to put an end to the problem.
I see. I mean, it's an extraordinarily interesting position for you to have put yourself in, because you are arguing in an extremely idealistic way in a world that is intensely commercial.
Well, it's corrupt. You see, when I grew up, I lived in a capitalist country. But today what we have is not what I would call capitalism. It's extreme capitalism. It's a society in which people have taken for granted that everything should be for sale. And I just call that corrupt.
When was there a time when everything wasn't for sale?
In the U.S. in the 1960s, enough representatives were elected who were in favor of restricting businesses that it often happened.
And so you're not trying to change the entire world, you're trying to change this bit of the world, and this is a distinctively political issue for you.
Well, the free software movement is concerned with these freedoms for computer users.
But, I mean, by extension, if computer users want that freedom, then where will it all end?
Well, I personally support a lot of other causes for freedom as well. I defend many other kinds of human rights that the Bush regime has totally trashed. But I didn't invent those movements. I just give them my help, as thousands of other people do.
You don't have an MP3 player and you don't have a cell phone, as we discovered this morning.
Actually, that's not quite
true. You do.
There is software. There's free software to play MP3 files.
Right.
Now, in the U.S., some distributors of this free software have been threatened with suits for patent infringement because the U.S. has an extremely stupid policy allowing software ideas to be patented. Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at your word processor, you'll see that it has hundreds of features, which add up to thousands of different ideas in the code itself. And any one of those could be patented in the U.S., which means that the developer of a word processor faces thousands, well, suppose only 10% of the ideas really are patented, then it's hundreds of potential lawsuits, perhaps from parties unknown that just happen to have got a patent or bought a patent on some one of those thousands of ideas.
Do you accept that there is such a thing as intellectual property?
It's a meaningless concept to even speak about. I'm not totally against copyright law, and I'm also not totally against patent law. I just say that patent law shouldn't be applied to software. But speaking of those two laws and a dozen other laws as well, as, quote, intellectual property, unquote, is a recipe for failing to understand even what the laws actually do, because they're totally different. They have very little in common, and all the rest is different. And if you lump them together like that, you will not understand anything. So anytime somebody has an opinion about, quote, intellectual property, unquote, it's a foolish opinion. I don't have one. I've intentionally removed that term from my discourse because I want to understand these various laws and I want to help you understand them as well. So I just explained that why patents in software are harmful. And they're dangerous to all software developers, and in some countries even the authorized users, authorized by the developer, can get sued by patent holders that they never heard of. But this is a totally different issue from the issue of free versus proprietary software, which tends to relate to copyright law but also to contracts. And meanwhile, there are also trademarks, which are basically a good system. Aside from a few details, I think the trademarks should exist, and I'm in favor of them. And so these are three different laws that you confuse together if you speak of, quote, intellectual property, unquote.
Is Microsoft still trying to, or thinking about trying to, seek royalties for patent infringement? Because it says, or it has been saying, that the Linux kernel alone violates 42 patents.
Well, who knows? Because, you see, most of those threats are kept secret. The perpetrator says to the victim, don't tell anybody what I've done to you. I heard from somebody whose name I don't know that his company, which was running the GNU/Linux system on a server, was threatened by Microsoft, and Microsoft demanded that they pay for the use of various ideas that are implemented in the system. But he wouldn't tell me his name or the company's name, so I don't actually have any hard evidence that I could present in a court, for instance. Not that there's anything we could sue them about. But the thing is, there's so many of these patents that people don't even bother to ask whether any of these accusations is really justified, because there are just too many. They think it's easier to pay.
So is there an international support for your foundation?
Well, yes, and the free software movement is quite strong in various countries such as Spain, Germany, France, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, and Argentina.
Why is it particularly strong in some countries and not others, do you think?
I don't know.
I mean, I'm wondering whether it comes back to a sort of political sensibility.
One thing that may help is that in Spanish, if you say libre, it's not gratuito. So these two different meanings of the English word free have different words.
Richard, we have to break for the news now. Richard Stallman continued. Richard Stallman is the leader of the free software movement, as he explained before the news. He's campaigning for 4 basic freedoms involved with free software: the user's ability to run a program as they wish, to study the source code, to change it so the program does what they wish, the ability to help your neighbour by making and distributing exact copies, and the freedom to contribute to the community by making and distributing copies of modified programs. In other words, it's a philosophy, a political philosophy. Just before we had to break for the news, Richard, we were talking about international interest, and you were talking about Spain and Libre.
Well, in Spain and in general in Spanish-speaking countries, it's easy to make the distinction between these two different meanings of the word free, because they have different words. We sometimes even say and write libre in English to help clarify this, but we also say, think of free speech, not free beer.
Yeah, and that's your distinction, really, because if it's intellectual property...
But nothing's intellectual property. But
no.
There is proprietary software, and sometimes proprietary software is available gratis, but it's still not acceptable if it doesn't respect your freedom. On the other hand, people do buy and sell copies of free software. That's entirely acceptable. It's permitted by all the free software licenses, because we're not against business. We're for freedom.
Somebody has emailed us to say that if you're against proprietary software and interfaces, can you ask him, and this is the question to you, how can you possibly travel in a modern car and not feel guilty or ashamed, as these days cars use software on their onboard computers to control almost everything from fuel injection to alarms to central locking?
First of all, I don't own a car, and I don't mind if I, use the computer of some place I'm visiting for a little while, even if it has Windows in it. I wouldn't have a computer set up for me to use with Windows or own one. But if I'm just visiting a place, I don't make those insistences on what other people do. But yeah, it is a real issue with cars, and it gets in the way of people's wishing to service their own cars. In the U.S., laws have been proposed to try to do something about this. So this exactly shows you why proprietary software is bad.
What about pharmaceutical companies? Does your philosophy extend to their kind of patents?
Well, first of all, software and pharmaceuticals are very different.
But intellectual property is the
But
link.
no one should talk about, quote, intellectual property, unquote, because it leads people to overgeneralize between things that have nothing in common. Now, software is something that is easy to modify for millions of people who have learned programming. But pharmaceuticals are totally different. To modify a pharmaceutical in a useful way is extremely hard, and then you'd have to test your modification. So you couldn't come up with two issues that are more different.
If economic gains are not guaranteed by private software rights, would that not lead to less innovation on the part of computer companies, software companies?
I don't know, and I don't care.
No, well, that's an interesting response. Why don't you care?
Because I want freedom more than I want innovation. If somebody develops an innovative proprietary program, I'm not going to use it because I have to reject it in order to keep my freedom. So as I see it, there's no value in that innovation at all unless and until we develop a free program which embodies the same improvement. So I would just as soon that he not develop that innovative but freedom-trampling program because it's an attractive nuisance. Other people who don't care as much about their freedom may be lured to give up their freedom by that attractive feature on a poisonous program. So what I feel is that those people should not develop that software. A plan to develop a proprietary program is a plan to set up a pitfall with bait to lure people in, and you shouldn't do it. It's better to do nothing.
Were you brought up political?
To some extent. My mother was a liberal, like about more or less half the citizens of the U.S. at the time. And to that extent, I was political.
And you were, I think, a classic maths nerd or a geek, yeah?
Yes. By the way, before we have to finish, I'd like to talk a bit about New Zealand's recent copyright law.
You may.
Which I think is a bit more important than
you
my
being a
childhood.
maths geek. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that if we had an hour. But one of the big obstacles to free software today is the adoption of laws that prohibit free software. In the U.S., there are two of them. One of them is patent law. Of course, that's not limited to free software. Any program can be the target of that kind of prohibition in the U.S. But it's particularly bad for us because our goal is to supply all of people's software needs. So if there's one thing we're not allowed to do, that is a serious problem. But the other prohibition has to do with digital restrictions management. And that, which is also called DRM for short, means publishing things in encrypted secret formats to stop people, to control how the users use their copies. For instance, DVDs are designed this way. And the format of a DVD was originally secret. And the companies that set up this conspiracy required everyone making a DVD player to sign a contract with them, promising that those DVD players would restrict the users just like all the other DVD players, which is why, by the way, there's no innovation or progress in DVD players. But somebody figured out the secret format and wrote a free program that you could put in your computer and use it to watch a DVD. You could also use it to copy a DVD, which I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to do.
As long as you're not selling it.
Yeah. So the point is, these companies having failed with secrecy, then got the U.S. to adopt a law prohibiting the distribution of those free programs that you could use to escape from the digital handcuffs that they had built into their formats. Well, today we see digital restrictions management abounds. For instance, Microsoft does it, and Apple does it, and Google does it, and Amazon and Sony do it in their ebook readers, the Amazon Swindle and the Sony Shredder. So, which you should never buy. You shouldn't get any product that's designed to put handcuffs on you. But of course, we don't just want to boycott them. We want to develop free software that you could use, for instance, to watch your DVD, read your ebook, listen to the music record that looks like a CD but isn't one, and all these other things that you might want to do, which you have a perfect right to do. Even you have a right to watch the DVD. You have a right to read the book. But the free software to do this is censored in the U.S. and also now to some extent in New Zealand because of that bad law. The New Zealand law is not quite as nasty as the U.S. law, but that's no excuse for it to exist at all.
Man is born free, Richard, but everywhere is in chains.
I'm afraid so.
One
Especially
final question.
now with Bush.
Well, you haven't got much longer to wait for a change in that direction anyway.
I'm afraid his successor will be no better.
Oh, do you think?
It's clear. It's not very likely that Nader will win or Cynthia McKinney. And other than that, I'm afraid his successor is going to be no better.
You're right. We haven't got an hour to spend talking about you being a maths nerd, but I do have one final question from a listener who says Google is powered by free software, but it doesn't distribute software. It provides a service. Because it does not in the main distribute software, it's not subject to your GPL license. So
Yes.
you now have a license to handle this problem, but it's too late. No one uses it. Do you concede, asks the listener, that you might wake
Concede
up...
what?
That you might wake up one day, find that Google is bigger and scarier than Microsoft ever was, and think, oops, my fault.
This is a number of important issues which have been mixed together so that it's impossible to answer them without separating out the individual issues.
Feel free to separate.
First of all, is Google doing something wrong when they improve certain programs in the GNU Plus Linux system and then run them on their servers? I don't think so. I think that's part of what everyone's entitled to do. You also are entitled to make improvements in a program and run them. Secondly, is Google doing something wrong with those servers? That's a different question. I would say yes and no, depending on which server it is, which service. For instance, people mostly think of Google's search engine. I don't see anything wrong with that, at least not in regard to the issues of free software. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with running a search engine or with using one. Now, people might say if Google's search engine is the main one, will they have too much influence? Maybe so. That's a very different kind of issue and not related to the free software issue. But Google has other servers. For instance, there is something called Google Docs, which is a spreadsheet and a word processor. And how does it work? Well, first of all, Google distributes a proprietary program to your computer. And it gets installed in your computer, but you don't notice this because it's just inside your browser. So for this reason, people do it and they don't even realize that they're running a proprietary program. Well, this is totally unacceptable. But what about the server itself? The server is running a combination of some free software that Google got and perhaps improved, and some other programs that Google simply wrote. And I don't see anything wrong with that. But using somebody else's server to do your word processing or your spreadsheet is a terrible mistake because it means you give up control of your computing. You're doing your computing in somebody else's server, and you can't have freedom if you do that. So you just mustn't do it. But this has nothing to do with whether the software in Google's server is free. I hope it is free because Google deserves to have control over the software running in its server, and if it runs a proprietary program, then it's lost control. But that's a separate issue from your control of your computing. And to do that, you've got to do it in your computer or a computer you control with your copy of a free program. So even if Google were to publish the source code of all the software in the Google Docs server, well, that would be a nice contribution to our community, but it wouldn't solve this problem. The only solution is run your word processor on your computer. But this only applies to certain kinds of servers. The the search engine is a server too, but it's doing a different kind of job. It's not doing your computing. You're just looking through Google's data. Well, that's a totally different kind of situation and a different issue.
All right, thanks for that. We're nearly out of time. Do you compare what you're talking about to, for example, Monsanto's Terminator gene seeds?
Yes, that is similar. One of the few other areas outside of information in computers where there's something similar to this issue is in agriculture, and the reason is farmers can copy their plants and animals. Of course, it's not totally the same. They're not exact copies. They recombine their genes, but it's similar. So forbidding farmers to save their seeds is evil. And it's not just Monsanto which is trying to do this technically, but there are many patented plant varieties, and also there are plant varieties with patented genes also from Monsanto, I believe. And farmers get sued because their corn crop received pollen from genetically modified corn in another field, perhaps miles away, and now a certain fraction of them have the patented gene, and so Monsanto sues them for patent infringement. So essentially, Monsanto is sabotaging agriculture.
I appreciate your time. Thank you, and thank you for putting up with such a disruptive morning, what with fire alarms and...
Sure, and remember, people should be free to share non-commercially exact copies of any published work, because sharing is friendship, and to attack sharing is to attack the bonds of society.
Well, in the spirit of friendship and upholding the bonds of society, Richard, and at your request, the audio for today's programme will be provided in the non-proprietary, that is free, OGG Vorbis format, as well as the usual formats from our webpage, radionz.co.nz/Saturday. Later on today, Richard Stallman, and you can get details of his presence and speaking engagements if you go on our website as well.